Hey, welcome back. So we've seen how report level filters can make pivot tables more dynamic data analysis tools for our end users, while also giving us the flexibility to add more dimensions to our pivot than we could feasibly fit into the rows and columns areas. However, Excel gives us an even more powerful and flexible filtering tool called slicers, which can help turn your pivot tables into a dynamic reporting system. Let's see how. So my first step here is going to be to add slicers to our example pivot table on the same fields that we currently have added as report level filters. So I've already clicked inside my pivot table, so I have my Pivot Table Analyze contextual tab on the ribbon. And on this tab, I'm going to want to click the Insert Slicer button. So if I click that, now we see a list of all the fields available to us from our source dataset. So I want to add slicers for the same two fields that we currently have report level filters for. So that will be call type description and site. And now I'll click OK. And we see that instead of a couple of conventional looking filter buttons, we actually get these little boxes that just popped up in the middle of our worksheet. And as you might suspect, we can actually click and drag these boxes to reposition them wherever we want. So right off the bat, we have more visual flexibility than we did with report level filters, which are always in the same position relative to the overall pivot table. So now I'll just reposition our slicers a little more logically above and to the right of our pivot. Now actually using slicers is pretty daggone intuitive. You'll note that we already had our report level filter for site set to Jacksonville, Florida. And you see on our site slicer that Jacksonville, Florida is highlighted and our other two sites are not. This reflects that a filter is currently being set on Jacksonville, Florida. But if I click another site value in the slicer, and now not only does our data change, and not only is Aurora, Colorado now highlighted in our slicer, but we can see that the value in our report level filter changed to align with our slicer. So our slicers essentially can control what we see in those report level filters. Which begs the question, why would we need slicers and report level filters? And the answer is, you really just don't. So I'll actually go ahead and remove our report level filters by going to my field list and then just removing both of my report level filters, because now our slicers give us all that functionality in a much more attractive, visually intuitive package. Now, just like with any other filter, you can filter for one item at a time, like we've already seen, or you can filter for multiple items at once. So if we click this little icon with multiple check marks above the items in our slicer, this will enable the multi-select mode of the slicer, which means instead of just being able to select one item at a time, we'll be able to select multiple. So now if I click Jacksonville, Florida, that will unselect it, while the other two items remain selected. And similarly, on my call type description slicer, I can click any number of items to unselect them and then simply click them again to select them. So I have the same filtering flexibility I had before, but a much more intuitive visual interface to communicate to the user of the pivot table exactly what filters are being applied and are not. Recall that with a report level filter, if multiple items are selected, you can't actually see which ones are selected unless you click the filter. So if I actually add one of our fields back as a report filter, let's say call type description, and now if I select multiple items in that field, you'll see that our report level filter just says multiple items, but my call type description slicer clearly highlights the two items that have been selected. Now, aside from making our filter selections more obvious and intuitive, slicers also give us a lot of flexibility in terms of how to style them. For example, we can resize them. So if I select a slicer, I can hover my cursor over any of these dots around the perimeter of the slicer and then just drag in any direction to resize the slicer however I want. So I'll actually do that to both of them. I can also change the caption that appears above each slicer. For example, this call type description caption seems a little too technical and not quite user-friendly enough for a pivot table that might be used by somebody who's not particularly technical. So to change that, After selecting the slicer, I'll simply click this contextual menu that pops up on the ribbon only when you select a slicer. We see that at the very top right of the ribbon. So if I click that contextual ribbon tab, over on the left side of that tab, you'll see a box for slicer caption. So I'll change call type description to just call type. And that already looks a lot better. Also on the slicer tab of the ribbon, we have a number of built-in pre-configured styles that Excel provides us for slicers. So if I click this down arrow to the right of those styles, I could choose any one of them to apply to our slicer. This works just the same as with the built-in styles for Excel tables or pivot tables. But for now, I'll revert back to the default light style. And lastly, to clear whatever filters we've applied via our slicers, we can simply click the funnel with the little red X on it at the top right of each slicer. Now, aside from simply being more visually intuitive and attractive, slicers have another really important advantage versus report filters in a pivot table. So we've already discussed that in reality, you're really limited to a certain number of row or column groups in your pivots due to concerns about readability. The solution is often to create multiple pivot tables that present different views of your data. One problem with this solution is that if you have filters on each of your pivot tables, setting that filter to a certain value on one pivot table won't affect the data in the other. And this can lead to your two views of your data being out of sync, which is obviously a bad experience for an end user. But slicers allow you to solve that problem by using one slicer to control multiple pivot tables. So let's see how. So let's say, for example, we want to create a second view of our data in which we group the data on our row labels by date instead of by employee hierarchy. So instead of rebuilding this pivot table from scratch, I'm actually just going to copy and paste it, which is a great way to save time when you're building variations of the same pivot table. The important thing to remember when copying and pasting a pivot table is that you need to copy all the cells that are part of that pivot table. If you miss part of the pivot table, you'll just copy the values from the pivot, but not the pivot itself. So once again, I'll go ahead and remove my report level filter. And then, starting with the top left cell in my pivot, I'll scroll down until I've selected the entire pivot, and then hit Control-C to copy. And then a couple columns over, I'll hit Control-V to paste. And then just to get our pivots aligned and below our slicers, I'll again copy the very first pivot, and now hit Control-X to cut, and then select cell A10 and Control-V to paste. So now we essentially have two identical pivot tables. But what we're going to do is change the row groupings in one to be dates instead of employee hierarchies. So I'll actually do that in our first pivot table. So back to my field list, I'll remove manager name and employee name, and then I'll add our call timestamp. And for this demonstration, I'll stick with Excel's default recommendation of grouping our data by month and then by day. But to get a clearer view of the detailed data, I'll right-click one of my month groupings, hover over Expand and Collapse, and then choose Expand Entire Field. So now I'll see my individual day breakouts under my month breakouts. So just a little more cleanup before we put our slicers to work. I actually don't think I need two columns between our pivots, so I'll delete one of those columns. And now I'll drag our slicers to be somewhat central above our two pivots. So now we're ready to see the power of controlling multiple pivot tables with different views of our data with a single slicer. So if, for example, I select a call type of billing, you'll see the numbers in both of our pivot tables decrease accordingly. So now I have two completely distinct views of our data, both of which can be controlled with multiple levels of filtering by one set of slicers. Now keep in mind that we were able to connect these slicers to both pivot tables without any additional steps because the second pivot table was copied from the first. Now if we had created a brand new pivot table from the same data set but not copied it from the original, we'd have had to take one extra step to connect our slicers to that second pivot table. So if I select one of our slicers, and then again select that slicer tab on the ribbon, and then hit the Report Connections button, you'll see a list of the pivot tables our slicers are connected to. In this case, just the 2 pivot tables we have here. But if I had created a third pivot table from our data set from scratch, not by copying and pasting one of the existing pivot tables, that pivot table would appear in this list, but unchecked. But all we'd have to do is just check the box next to it, and then we could control that pivot with these slicers as well. So I hope you can see what a powerful feature this is. Using slicers to control multiple pivot tables that provide different views of your data are the key to creating dashboards with a number of at-a-glance views that can be controlled by a single filter. Okay, so our pivot tables have grown fairly sophisticated. But one thing that's remained fairly simple is the actual calculations we're doing in our pivot tables. To this point, pretty much simple counts, sums, and averages. Up next, we'll look at some techniques for adding more sophisticated calculations to our pivot tables. I'll see you then.